I'm on night 3 of my set of night shifts, and the theme tonight seems to be taking the time to do things. And sometimes on night shifts you don't have the time. You have to prioritize the most urgent patients and just see them one after another. But tonight the pace has been slower, and if I have the time to spend with a patient, I'd much rather do that if I can avoid giving them medication for something that can be resolved just by speaking to them for a while. So let me give you 2 examples. One of them was a patient that I was called for on the psych ward who was very agitated, very aggressive towards the nurses, and so they called me sort of urgently to come and see him. They'd already given him some benzos that he had as PRN to try and calm him down a bit and make him less agitated, and that hadn't seemed to work very well. So my approach when I'm called for an agitated or confused or aggressive patient is to first think why. Before you think treat, first think why. And there's lots of reasons for confusion. I'm not going to go into much detail, but the quick things I think of is, has there been any recent changes in their medication? Is the patient in pain? Because pain can cause confusion. Has the patient been able to urinate and open their bowels? Because that also can cause confusion. You'll have very often times, especially in elderly patients that I'm working with right now, you can have patients who are constipated and leads to urinary retention. They don't present with abdominal symptoms, but they present with confusion. So always think of what the cause could be before you just treat the patient. Then obviously you think of the acuity, whether the patient is being aggressive, and then with any medication like benzodiazepines or other, it's complicated. You know, some doctors give them more easily than others, and all these medications are associated with risks, especially in elderly patients with increased risk of falls, etc. So it's not something you want to give lightly. So my approach generally is, if a patient is being harmful to themselves or others, so aggressive, then I would give medication. But then once I've understood, obviously there's a cause that I can fix, because if you don't fix the cause, then you can keep giving medication, but it's not going to fix the issue in the long run. And if a patient is, you know, slightly disorientated, walking around in the corridors, not necessarily at risk of falls, and not putting himself or others in danger, then, you know, I wouldn't necessarily give medication. You have to appreciate that it can be really difficult for nurses on a shift, whether it be a night shift or a day shift, to manage multiple patients who are doing this without giving them medication. So it's a discussion to be had, you know, with the medical team, with the nurses, and really evaluating the pros and cons of these treatments for patients. So anyways, this patient, I essentially sat down with him for about half an hour. He was a patient admitted with severe depression and anxiety, and talking for 30 minutes didn't fix everything. He was definitely a lot better once we had spoken. He was calm. He actually went back to bed. He lay down, and I haven't been called back for him since. So I'm hoping that things are okay for the nurse on the psych ward. But that's just one example of taking the time to speak to a patient before just rushing to medication as a solution. Right now I'm headed to the, the on-call room to get a bit of sleep before someone calls me. The actual stress of being on a night shift often means that you're not sleeping even when people aren't calling you, because you're waiting for those calls. But I'm really tired tonight, so I'm going to try and make the most of it. The other patient that I want to talk about is one that I was called for because she was hypertensive, so at around 190/90, I believe, and presenting with headaches as well. So first of all, I think of the urgent things that I don't want to miss. So raised intracranial pressure, determining whether it's a hypertensive emergency or a hypertensive urgency. So in a hypertensive emergency, you get signs of end organ damage, whether that be the brain or the heart, or the kidneys. You can have signs like an acutely confused patient or a lowering GCS. You can have visual problems, headaches, things like that. And that's definitely an emergency, so you want to make sure that you treat that rapidly. Whereas a hypertensive urgency is where you've got a raised blood pressure. I believe the criteria is above 180 systolic, but you don't have signs of end organ damage. And so for that, you need to evaluate your patient. And it can be difficult on a night shift where you're often called for high blood pressures, and you're not necessarily going to see every single patient. And so I think to be able to triage and to prioritize which patients you need to see urgently, which patients you need to see, it's really helpful to have a look at the chronicity. To look at the blood pressures over the last week. Have they all been generally raised? Is this patient with known hypertension that is not well controlled, where you need to adapt their sort of long-term medication? Has this patient received any PRN doses for antihypertensives? What are the other OBS like? Is the patient tachycardic? And then again, like the confused patient, think what could be causing this high blood pressure? And you definitely need to think of the common things like pain. A patient who's in pain will have a raised blood pressure oftentimes. Think of the context in which the blood pressure was taken. Was the patient active just before then? Had he just done his physiotherapy session, or I don't know, gone for some exercise? The patient agitated, anxious, stressed? Strong emotions can make your blood pressure go up. And have there been any acute changes to their medication? So those are very quickly the things that you can go over. This patient in particular was treated for hypertension, also known for fibromyalgia, anxiety, depression, all long term. And so I decided to take the time to go see her because it wasn't very clear on the phone what the cause of her high blood pressure was. And although she was known to have high blood pressure, I could see that the values during the week were sort of very fluctuant, but with peaks as high as 180. And I went to see her, and this was a patient clinically, in terms of the examination, completely normal. On my arrival, she was essentially crying, very anxious, not doing well at all. And so we spent about an hour speaking about the things that were causing her to be anxious, mostly, her personal sort of life difficulties and the things that had brought her here, how she's worried about her husband who's at home, who's in a worse state physically than her. And so there were lots of things on her mind that were sort of bubbling up in the evening when she was alone and there was no one else to sort of talk to and nothing else to do to keep herself busy. And it was putting her in a right state. And after that 1 hour of talking, and essentially me mostly listening to her, she was so reassured. She felt so much better. She no longer had a headache and her blood pressure had gone down. It had gone down to about 170. We still obviously continued the OBS during the night, but she didn't need any additional medication. Had essentially reached her sort of normal baseline. It was still high and her regular medication needed to be adjusted. But I was lucky enough to not be called during that time and just have that 1 hour to sit down with her and listen. It's not always the case. Sometimes it doesn't help. Sometimes you don't have the time to do it. And sometimes there's actually another, medical cause for the high blood pressure or the headache. So don't always think that an anxious patient has high blood pressure because of their anxiety. For me, it was a good reminder because sometimes on call you're super busy, you're stressed, and you just sort of deal with the issues that you're faced with as quickly as possible. When you have the time, take time. And also, don't jump straight to medication. If you can avoid it, try and find alternate means to help your patients. So this lady, I referred her to psych for some follow-up in the long term. It just goes to show how something really simple like lending an ear to someone can make a massive difference to their day or night. That's pretty it for now. Otherwise, the start of the shift was pretty busy. But yeah, now there's a bit of a lull, so I'm going to make the most of it and try and sleep. As you can see here, I do have a proper bed. And it's nice to have access to the computers and have a real phone, which you probably saw on my my other night shift vlogs in the UK. Well, in that particular hospital, we had bleeps, which is slightly annoying because you have to go find a phone to answer it. Whereas here, it rings on the phone and I can answer straight away, which is pretty handy.